It was 6:47 a.m. when Gwen Wilkins stepped out of her small, second-floor apartment in Chicago, her boots crunching against the frost-covered sidewalk. The city was still asleep, wrapped in the early morning fog, the faint light of dawn barely breaking over the horizon. The air was crisp, biting at her cheeks as she made her way to the edge of the street. Her hands were buried deep in the pockets of her coat, but the warmth from the coat was nothing compared to the cold, hollow feeling in her chest. This wasn't the first time she'd stood outside the building with the small business sign on the door. The sign that had once been a beacon of promise. It now felt more like a grave marker for something she'd lost. She wasn't ready to go inside. Not yet. The key she held in her hand was still wrapped in the same foil she had used to protect it last night. Her fingers pressed against the smooth metal, trying to ease the tension building deep inside her. Gwen glanced down the street. A few old-timers shuffled past, their heavy coats drawn tight, each lost in their own thoughts. The world kept moving forward, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had stopped. She'd been here too many times, standing in front of this place she had helped build, trying to convince herself that she was strong enough to fight through it. But deep down, she knew she wasn't here because she was strong. She was here because she had no choice. The cafe had once been her dream. The two of them, Gwen and Danny, had poured their souls into it, turning it into something people from all over Chicago had come to love. She had been the backbone of everything, creating recipes, making connections, serving with a smile. It was their business, a dream built on trust. And it had been beautiful until one day it wasn't. She thought about the last phone call she'd received from him, a month ago. "It's over, Gwen. I'm done. I can't do this anymore." Those words rang in her ears even now, as if they were the soundtrack to a life she never fully understood. With every phone call he made after that, every promise he broke, and every time he slowly pulled away from her, Gwen had stayed. Stayed to fix what was broken. Stayed to keep the dream alive. Stayed to believe in the person who had once promised to stand by her side. But she had been a fool. She hadn't seen it until it was too late. Gwen shifted her weight, staring at the reflection of the building in the puddle by the curb. It was early enough that the world hadn't yet begun to buzz with life, but she could already hear the sounds of the city. Buses rolling by, car horns in the distance, people rushing to their next destination. And then there was the faint hum of a quiet desperation deep inside her. "Enough," she whispered to herself, her breath visible in the cold morning air. It was the first time in a long while she had said anything aloud to herself. It was small. It was quiet. But it was enough. Enough to stop her from breaking down right here, right now. She wasn't sure when she'd stopped caring about what Danny had taken from her. But somewhere between the final betrayal and the moment she stood before this empty building, it had happened. She wasn't here to win him back. She wasn't even sure she could. But she wasn't here to fail either. The key in her hand felt like it weighed a ton. Yet Gwen gripped it tightly, her fingers closing around it as though it might save her. It was the only thing that had kept her tethered to something real for so long. And despite everything that had happened, it still had power. The door to the cafe was locked, but that didn't matter. The keys were hers. The idea that it could be taken from her, that the very thing she had helped create, could be destroyed by someone who had never truly cared. Well, that was a wound she could still feel deep in her heart. Yet there was something more to it now. An ember of something far stronger than the betrayal and loss she had felt before. She was done being powerless. Gwen turned and walked back across the sidewalk, heading toward the bus stop. The fog clung to her every step, but she knew that there was something better waiting ahead, something she had to build alone. And this time, she would build it better than it had ever been before. If the story touched something in you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. Gwen's story had never been one of grandeur. It was one of quiet perseverance, a day-by-day grind that started in Detroit, a city that had long been known for its struggles, yet also for its resilience. She had met Danny at a local diner when she was just 23, waiting tables to pay off student loans while working on her degree in business. He was a charmer, a smooth talker with a vision for the future. He was everything she wasn't. Confident, bold, unafraid of taking risks. They clicked immediately, and for the first time, Gwen thought maybe she had found someone who would believe in her dreams the way she did. He pitched his big ideas to her like they were gospel, ambitious, grand, and full of potential. She fell for him hard, and with that fall came the belief that they could build something together. A cafe, he said, a cozy, intimate spot where they could serve coffee and food to the neighborhood. He promised they'd make it work. She'd always been a hard worker, practical and grounded. Danny's ideas seemed crazy at first, but she couldn't help but get swept up in his energy. But when it came to turning those ideas into reality, the cracks began to show. They started small, scraping together every penny to lease a small, rundown space in Chicago. The cafe had potential, but it needed love. Lots of it. Gwen was the one who had the vision for the interior design, the feel of the place. She picked out the light fixtures, chose the paint colors, and developed the menu, while Danny handled the business side of things. It worked for a while. They had no investors, no backers, just the two of them, scraping by with what little they had. But Gwen's ideas were always put to the side. Danny had a way of making her feel as though she wasn't the one who could make the important decisions, even though it was her who was in the kitchen, perfecting the recipes, who was interacting with the customers, who was building the community that had started to flourish around them. It was the first time Gwen had ever felt sidelined, like her role was secondary. Danny was the idea guy, and she was just the one who brought those ideas to life. Slowly, he began taking more control. He stopped listening to her suggestions, dismissed her input on new dishes, and made every business decision without her. When Gwen questioned him, he would shrug her off. "Trust me, Gwen. I've got this," he would say, a small smile on his face, as if he were the only one who truly understood how this business would work. But that smile, that confident air, started to feel like a mask. In their second year of business, things started to pick up. The cafe was busy, the food was great, and customers kept coming back. But it was also during this time that Gwen started noticing small changes in Danny. He started taking longer lunches, showing up to meetings late, and becoming more dismissive toward her. He was flirting with other women, making deals without telling her, and most painfully of all, taking credit for the work they had both put into building the cafe. Gwen was still there, still working day and night, but it was as if she didn't matter anymore. The tipping point came one cold December afternoon, just as their busiest holiday season began. Gwen had spent hours preparing a new holiday menu, a menu she was proud of. She even brought in a new local supplier to bring in fresh ingredients, working tirelessly to ensure it was perfect. But when Danny returned from a meeting with an investor, he had a new plan, one that completely disregarded everything Gwen had done. "I've decided to go in a different direction," he told her, not meeting her eyes. "I'm going to change the entire menu and bring in a new chef." Gwen's heart sank. She couldn't believe it. She had poured herself into this business, into this place, into Danny. And now, with one decision, he was erasing everything she had done. Her efforts, her passion, had no place in his grand vision. The cafe had gone from something they had built together to something that only existed because of him. "What do you mean, a new chef? I've been here every day for the past 2 years." Gwen's voice trembled, but she stood firm, her hands clutching the edges of the counter. "I know," Danny replied, almost apologetically, but it felt hollow. "But this is the way forward, Gwen. You know that." She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him understand the weight of her disappointment. But instead, she just stood there, numb. The cafe, their dream, wasn't hers anymore. It had never been. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll always have a place here, Gwen, but I think it's time for you to step aside." That was the moment everything changed. In that cold, sterile meeting room, Gwen knew she had been replaced. She wasn't just a partner in the business anymore. She was the woman who had been used up and thrown away. Gwen walked out that day with nothing but the clothes on her back. There was no contract. There was no warning. Just an abrupt end to a chapter she had believed would last forever. The cafe kept running, but it wasn't hers anymore. And that was the hardest pill to swallow. Back in her apartment that night, Gwen looked around at the walls she had carefully decorated and the pieces of furniture they had picked out together. It all felt so trivial now. What was it all for? The work? The dreams? The late nights? Had she been so foolish to think this could ever last? Was this all just another failure she'd have to walk away from? The quiet buzz of the refrigerator in the corner broke her thoughts, but she couldn't ignore the feeling creeping over her. The realization that Danny had taken everything from her. Her dreams, her purpose, her heart. But Gwen Wilkins was not someone to go down without a fight. She wiped her face and made a decision. It wasn't over. Not yet. Gwen knew something had been wrong for a while, but the truth had only come crashing down in the cold light of that December afternoon. Danny's words echoed in her mind like an unbearable hum, louder and sharper with every passing day. She had always been the one to hold everything together, the silent force behind their shared dream. And yet, here she was, standing alone in an empty apartment, trying to piece together the remnants of a life she had spent years building alongside him. What hurt the most wasn't just the loss of the cafe. It was the loss of the trust she had once given him so freely. That connection they had built over the years, the mutual understanding, the shared sacrifices, had all been ripped away in a single decision. She had invested everything into their partnership, and now, as if it had all been for nothing, Danny had erased her role in the very thing they had both created. But what truly shattered her was the response of the people closest to her, the ones she thought would have her back no matter what. Marlene, her mother, had always been the strong, no-nonsense woman from St. Louis, a woman who never hesitated to speak her mind. But this time, even she didn't know how to respond. When Gwen called her that night, her voice trembling with betrayal, all Marlene could offer were words that felt like weak salves. "Gwen, honey, you need to get out of there. You've been living in his shadow for too long." Gwen's heart sank. Her mother had always been her rock. But in that moment, Marlene's words felt like they were coming from a place of fear. Fear that Gwen might never find her way out of the wreckage. "You're going to be okay," Marlene said, but the doubt in her voice was unmistakable. "But you need to move on." It wasn't the support Gwen had been hoping for. She had expected to hear something stronger, something that could anchor her in her grief. Instead, she was left with a cold emptiness that mirrored her own thoughts. Was her mother right? Had she been stuck in Danny's world for too long to see beyond it? Had she become so enmeshed in his success that she had forgotten her own? But what was even worse than the cold silence from Marlene was the suffocating absence of support from the one person Gwen had always thought would understand her pain the most. Kelsey, her best friend from Chicago. They had been inseparable since childhood, always turning to each other in times of trouble. Kelsey had been the first person to know about Gwen's dreams, the one who had cheered her on when she decided to open the cafe with Danny. Yet when Gwen called her to share the news of the betrayal, Kelsey's response was shockingly indifferent. "Kelsey, he took everything from me. Everything." Gwen's voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of the words too heavy to carry. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a half-hearted sigh. "I'm sorry, Gwen. That's really hard. But you knew he was always like that, right? You can't be surprised." The words hit Gwen like a slap in the face. She had expected empathy, understanding, even anger on her behalf. But all she got was an echo of what she already knew. Kelsey had been waiting for this moment. She had always believed Danny wasn't right for Gwen. The doubt that Gwen had pushed aside for years was suddenly staring her in the face, and it was coming from someone who was supposed to have her back. Tears welled up in Gwen's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had been dismissed too many times, by Danny, by her friends, and now by her own family. It was as though everyone had already written her off as weak, as the woman who couldn't hold on to what she had built. But something inside her snapped. She couldn't stay here, drowning in self-pity, waiting for others to validate her. She had been through this too many times before, as a child, growing up in a neighborhood where nobody had given her the time of day. But she had risen above that. This wasn't the end. This was just another beginning. Gwen's hands shook as she wiped her face, steadying herself against the cold, wooden table. She would have to leave Chicago, She couldn't stay in the place where she had been both hurt and healed, where everything that had once been hers was now tainted with betrayal. Her life needed a new chapter, and it couldn't be written in the ruins of the past. As Gwen packed a small suitcase, she felt the heaviness of everything she was leaving behind. The city that had been her home for years, the memories of a life she had invested so much into. And Danny, she would leave Chicago, but not without a plan. Not without an idea of what would come next. She wouldn't let him win. She wouldn't let her failure be defined by him. Her mother had been right about one thing. She had spent too long in Danny's shadow. Now it was time to step into the light. She headed out to the airport the next morning, her heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and determination. It was time to start over. Gwen stood in the cold, unwelcoming terminal of Austin Bergstrom International Airport, her suitcase rolling behind her as she walked toward the taxi stand. Austin was nothing like Chicago. The air here felt fresh, untamed, like an open field that was waiting to be explored. It was almost as if the city was offering her a new kind of freedom, a chance to redefine herself far from the painful memories of the past. The decision to leave had been a difficult one, but in the quiet of the taxi ride from the airport to her new apartment, Gwen felt something she hadn't in months. A sense of relief. For the first time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't trying to fit into a space that had been too small for her. She wasn't stuck in the old patterns that had kept her tied to a dream that wasn't hers anymore. As the taxi rolled through the streets of Austin, she saw a city that was vibrant, full of new opportunities. The buzzing lights, the mix of cultures, and the quiet, steady rhythm of the city felt different, like a fresh start. Gwen had spent years pouring her energy into something that was never meant to be hers. Now it was time to start again on her own terms. She had always dreamed of running a business, not just a cafe, but something that reflected her vision. Her experience in the kitchen, her love of connecting with people over a meal. It was all there, waiting to be channeled into something new. But even more than that, she had the lessons from the last few years to carry with her. She wasn't just leaving Chicago behind. She was leaving behind the woman who had allowed herself to be overshadowed, to be dismissed. Gwen settled into a modest, yet comfortable apartment in a small neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors actually said hello. It was the perfect spot for someone trying to start over. The city of Austin was growing, thriving. She didn't know where it would take her, but she had no illusions. She knew that this would be harder than anything she had done before, and that was okay, because this time it wasn't just about surviving. It was about building. The first week in Austin was a blur. Gwen spent most of her time familiarizing herself with the city, exploring the local food scene, and deciding which direction she wanted to take. She found a small cafe for rent, tucked away on a quiet corner street, just a few blocks from the downtown area. The space had the bones of something special. A small kitchen, large windows, and a cozy feel that would draw people in. Could be hers. She didn't have the money to rent it outright yet, but the idea was there. And with it came something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. But starting a business with nothing was no easy feat. The first few weeks were spent in a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings with potential investors, and hours spent working part-time as a barista at a local cafe just to keep afloat. At first, the grind felt just like it had in Chicago, but with each passing day, Gwen started to feel the weight of her past lifting. She was no longer defined by Danny's success, or her failures, or the hollow promises she had once believed in. She was just Gwen, and Gwen had something new to prove. One evening, as she closed the cafe for the night, she was cleaning the counter when a woman came in, looking for a quick coffee. She had the air of someone who didn't want to be bothered, but as she approached the counter, her eyes softened. "Busy day?" Gwen asked, offering a friendly smile. "Yeah, had to meet with a client in a few hours, but thought I'd grab a coffee to unwind," the woman said, her voice low but genuine. "You just starting out?" Gwen paused, wiping down the counter. "Yeah, I am," she said quietly, still figuring things out. "Not sure where it'll take me, but I've got a few ideas." The woman studied her for a moment, then smiled. "It's tough, right? Getting started from scratch. I've been there, but you've got to stick with it. You're doing good here. I can see it. You've got the spirit. Gwen smiled back, a bit surprised by the kindness. Thanks. That means a lot. The woman left with her coffee, but her words lingered in Gwen's mind. You've got the spirit. It felt like an acknowledgement of her struggle, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. She could do this. In the weeks that followed, Gwen worked tirelessly to build her vision. She'd learned from her time in Chi, wanted to stop, but this time there was no Danny. There were no distractions, no manipulations, just her and her dream. She spent long hours perfecting her business plan, designing a new menu, and finding a location. The hours were grueling, but each step felt like a victory. She started small, offering homemade pastries and specialty coffees in a small pop-up shop, with a menu that featured some of her old recipes from the cafe in Chicago, but with a personal twist. Slowly, she began building a loyal customer base. Word spread, and it didn't take long before people were coming to her, asking about the cafe they'd heard so much about. It was small, but it was hers, and that was everything. Every night after closing, Gwen would stand outside the pop-up shop and look at the lights of Austin stretching out in front of her. She wasn't yet where she wanted to be, but she was moving forward. She had built this place with her hands. It was a slow process, but one that meant more than anything she had ever done before. And for the first time in a long time, Gwen felt something inside her settle. The noise, the stress, the memories of betrayal, all of it was fading away. This was her time. The first few months in Austin had been grueling. Gwen had poured herself into her new venture with everything she had, not only because she wanted it to succeed, but because it had become her lifeline. Her own cafe, her own rules, her own success. It was the life she had dreamed of, long before Danny's betrayal. But what Gwen didn't expect was how quickly her past would come knocking. It started one morning when she received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Gwen. Danny's voice was smooth, the kind of voice that could calm you even when he was the last person you wanted to hear. I need to talk to you. It's important. For a moment, she felt a flash of something, a mixture of anger, grief, and exhaustion. But there was also curiosity. Why now? Why was Danny reaching out after all this time? After everything he had done to her? No, Gwen replied firmly, setting the coffee pot down on the counter. She was in the middle of a rush, but her hands were shaking. I don't need anything from you. You've already taken enough. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. Look, I get it. I know what I did was wrong. But Gwen, I need your help. This place is failing. I've made some bad investments and I can't fix it on my own. I need you to come back. We can rebuild it together. Gwen's heart skipped a beat, but the anger bubbled up, hot and fast. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. She had heard this before. The promises, the empty words, the false hope. She had given him everything and he had taken it all. You lost your chance, Gwen finally said, her voice cold but steady. You took everything from me, and now I'm doing this on my own. I don't owe you anything. She hung up before he could say another word. Gwen didn't need to hear the rest. This was no longer about him. But what hurt even more than Danny's attempt to pull her back into his web was the realization that he hadn't changed. He hadn't learned a thing. He still thought of her as an accessory to his success, a tool to use when it suited him. He couldn't see her as a woman who had the strength to build something on her own. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the growing tension in Austin, the pressure Gwen began to feel from the world around her. People were noticing her cafe, yes, but it was more than that. The whispers started, first from other restaurant owners, then from customers who knew her story. Did you hear? A customer asked one afternoon as she was preparing a batch of cinnamon rolls. Gwen Wilkins used to work with Danny, didn't she? I heard he's losing everything. The man can't hold a business together. It wasn't the first time Gwen had heard this. And every time, it hurt just a little more. Her association with Danny was still a part of her, no matter how hard she tried to erase it. People still saw her as the woman who had been with him, even though she was no longer with him at all. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. Gwen knew she had to make a choice. She could let Danny's ghost haunt her forever, or she could take control of her own destiny. She knew she couldn't keep running from the past, not when it was still so present in the minds of everyone around her. Her breakthrough came when she met Sasha, a local investor who had heard about Gwen's story through a mutual friend. Sasha was young, driven, and saw something in Gwen that no one else had. When they met for the first time, Gwen felt the walls she'd built around herself begin to crumble. "So, I hear you're the woman who used to be part of Danny's empire," Sasha said with a smile, sitting down across from her in a local diner. "But I also hear that you're doing something on your own now, and that's what I'm interested in." Gwen had been cautious, but Sasha's confidence was infectious. Over the next few weeks, they met multiple times, and Sasha made it clear that she saw the potential in Gwen's business, but more importantly, in Gwen herself. Sasha believed in her in a way that Gwen hadn't realized she needed. Gwen had been so focused on proving herself, to Danny, and to the people who doubted her, that she had forgotten the most important part. She needed to believe in herself first. Sasha's belief gave her that missing piece. With Sasha's backing, Gwen was able to secure a loan for her cafe and expand it into something bigger. She hired a talented chef and put her own stamp on the menu, blending local flavors with the familiar comfort foods she had always loved. The cafe became a community hub, a place where people came not just for food, but for connection. Gwen wasn't just selling meals. She was offering a slice of herself, a piece of her heart, her story, and her resilience. It wasn't easy, and it never would be. But Gwen knew she was on the right path. She had built something from the ground up, and now it was hers, fully hers. And nobody, not even Danny, could take that away from her. The expansion of Gwen's cafe in Austin was more than just a new venture. It was a declaration. It was a quiet proclamation to herself and to the world that she had rebuilt her life not just from the rubble of her past, but from the strength that had always lived inside her. Every day, she poured more of herself into the business. More love, more energy, more time than she ever had before. But even as her success grew, there was always one thing she couldn't shake. The feeling that Danny was still out there, lingering in the background of her life, waiting for the right moment to re-enter. That moment came on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day that started quietly and ended in chaos. Gwen was at the cafe, finalizing a menu update with Sasha when her phone buzzed with a message. She looked down, half expecting it to be another customer request, but the name on the screen sent a chill down her spine. Danny. Gwen stared at the screen for a moment, as if the name were a foreign object she didn't know how to handle anymore. After everything, how could he have the audacity to reach out? It had been months of silence, of rebuilding her life. And now he wanted something from her again? She had moved on, hadn't she? She had built something real, something all her own, and she couldn't let him have any part of it. She opened the message. "We need to talk. I know it's been a while, but there's something I need to discuss with you. It's urgent." Gwen's heart hammered in her chest. She had read enough. She didn't need to hear anything more. But curiosity gnawed at her. What could he possibly want now? A sudden decision jolted through her. She was done with this. He had no place in her life anymore. He had taken enough from her, and now he was trying to take more. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a response. She wouldn't let him come in and disrupt the peace she had fought so hard to create. Not this time. She had built her empire, and she wasn't about to let him tear it down. But that night, as she lay in bed, a new thought began to creep into her mind, one she couldn't shake. What if Danny's desperation wasn't about getting her back? What if it was about something else entirely? What if he was in trouble, real trouble, and he was reaching out not to manipulate her, but because he had no other options? The thought gnawed at her all through the night, keeping her awake long after the cafe had closed. What did she owe him after everything that had happened? The betrayal, the lies, the years of feeling small next to his inflated ego? And yet, in the silence of the night, she realized something. She didn't know him anything, but if he was in need, she wasn't the kind of person to turn her back on someone just because they had hurt her in the past. She had made it through everything by choosing to rise above. She had earned her peace, and she wasn't about to let bitterness cloud her judgment now. Maybe, just maybe, she could help him, but only on her terms. The next morning, Gwen called him. "Danny," she said when he answered the phone, the sound of his voice immediately stirring something inside her. "What's going on?" For a long moment, there was silence. And then he spoke, his voice weaker than she had ever remembered it. I've made some bad investments," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost ashamed. "I don't know what else to do, Gwen. I can't keep going like this. I'm drowning. I need your help." Gwen's stomach turned as she listened to him. The man who had once stood at the top, who had humiliated her, now broken and desperate. She could hear it in his voice, the desperation, the regret. For a fleeting moment, she felt a pang of something soft inside her, but she quickly shut it down. This was Danny, the man who had left her with nothing, the man who had thrown her aside like a discarded possession. She couldn't let him worm his way back into her life. She cleared her throat. "What exactly do you want from me, Danny?" "I don't know," he said, and she could hear the frustration in his voice. "I thought maybe you could help me with the business. You were always the smart one. You built that place. You had the vision. I can't do it alone anymore. I've lost everything. I need someone who knows how to fix it." Gwen's grip tightened on the phone. The old anger flared up again, hot and bitter. She had spent so many nights wondering if he would ever come back, if he would ever realize what he had lost. But hearing the defeat in his voice now, she couldn't help but wonder if he was sincere. Was he truly sorry for what he had done? Or was this just another manipulation, a last-ditch effort to get her back under his control? "I'm sorry, Danny," she said, her voice steady, but her heart pounding. "I can't help you. I've moved on. I've worked hard to build something for myself. I can't go back to that place. I won't." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, she wondered if he had hung up. But then, his voice came through again, soft, resigned. "I get it," he said quietly. "I've lost you. I know that now." Gwen swallowed hard. This was it. The end of the story she had spent so many years running from. Danny wasn't going to come back and destroy what she had worked for. She wouldn't let him. "Goodbye, Danny," she said, and hung up the phone, feeling a strange sense of closure wash over her. It wasn't just about ending their business partnership. It was about ending the last ties that had kept her bound to him. She had finally let go. The next morning, Gwen stood in the kitchen of her cafe, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the small space she had built into a sanctuary. This was hers, all of it. The victories, the struggles, the quiet moments of joy. It was all hers. Gwen smiled to herself. This was the turning point. She had not only survived the worst of what life had thrown her way, but she had emerged stronger. She had taken back control of her life, her business, and her future. And there was no going back. In the months following her final conversation with Danny, Gwen felt something she hadn't expected. Profound sense of peace. The phone call had been the closure she hadn't even known she needed. In a way, it had been the last vestige of her old life. Her life with Danny, her life in Chicago. And after that conversation, it felt as though she had finally cut the last cord binding her to that painful past. Her business was thriving. The cafe had become a true reflection of who she was. Warm, inviting, and grounded. There was a steady flow of customers, many of them locals who had heard about her story and felt drawn to support her. The walls, once barren, now held photographs of her favorite places. Places that had always inspired her, from the beaches of California to the quiet neighborhoods of New Orleans. Each picture, each personal touch, reminded Gwen of how far she had come and how much she had achieved without anyone's help but her own. But despite her success, she couldn't ignore the nagging sensation that something was still missing. The cafe was bustling, and her staff were wonderful, But Gwen knew deep down that this wasn't the end. It wasn't just about business for her anymore. It was about legacy. What would people remember her for? She spent weeks contemplating the next steps. Expansion? More locations? A cookbook? But none of those ideas felt right. The answer came on a warm, sunny day in early spring, just as the cafe's outdoor seating area was filling up with patrons. That's when she met Holly, a woman who walked into the cafe one afternoon, looking a little lost but hopeful. She had a look of determination in her eyes, the kind that reminded Gwen of herself when she had first opened the cafe all those years ago. Holly, it turned out, was a recent graduate of culinary school, eager to start her own restaurant but unsure of how to begin. Gwen saw something in Holly, a spark she hadn't realized she'd been missing in her own life. She took the young woman under her wing, showing her the ropes of running a business, sharing the lessons she had learned the hard way. It felt good, being able to pass on her knowledge, to empower someone who reminded her so much of herself. Holly's passion reignited something in Gwen that had slowly dimmed over the past few years. She had forgotten that feeling, the feeling of being excited about a new venture, the thrill of watching someone else grow. As the weeks passed, Gwen began to realize that her next step wasn't about expanding her business or chasing after more fame. It was about creating a space for others like Holly to flourish. The legacy she wanted to build wasn't one of fame or fortune, but of impact. She wanted to be remembered as someone who had taken the lessons of her failures and used them to guide others, to give them a chance to rise when they were overlooked, just like she had been. That's when she made the decision. She would open a mentorship program for aspiring chefs and restaurant owners, giving them the knowledge and support they needed to succeed. It wasn't just about teaching them how to cook or run a cafe. It was about giving them the tools to believe in themselves, to overcome the self-doubt and insecurities that so often held them back. She knew that her story, her journey from failure to success, was something that could inspire others, just as she had been inspired by those who had believed in her along the way. But even as Gwen planned for this new chapter, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she still hadn't fully come to terms with. There was one more piece of the puzzle missing, the one that had haunted her since her first days in Austin. One afternoon, Gwen sat at a table in the cafe, her journal open in front of her, staring out at the busy street as people walked by. Her mind kept drifting back to Danny, back to the broken promises, the betrayal, and the anger she had carried for so long. The quiet resentment had settled deep within her heart, and she realized that it was time to let it go. She had to find forgiveness, not for him, but for herself. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But little by little, Gwen worked through the pain. She realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing Danny's actions. It was about freeing herself from the hold they still had on her. She had spent so long fighting against him, resenting him, that she hadn't realized the only person who had been carrying the weight of that anger was her. So, one quiet evening, as she stood in the cafe after the last customer had left, she made peace with the past. She wrote a letter to Danny, not to send, but to release the emotions that had been tangled up inside her for so long. She wrote about how he had hurt her, about how much he had taken from her, and how, despite everything, she had risen. As she wrote, the weight lifted from her shoulders. She didn't need him to acknowledge her pain. She didn't need him to apologize. What she needed was to forgive herself for ever thinking that she wasn't enough, for ever thinking that she needed his approval to succeed. That night, Gwen folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and set it on the table in front of her. The silence in the cafe felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was peaceful. The air felt clear, like the weight of the world had been lifted from her chest. And for the first time in years, she felt free. The days following Gwen's decision to open the mentorship program felt like a quiet, confident breeze. She had no grand expectations, no fanfare. This wasn't about making headlines or building a brand. It was about something much deeper. Gwen had found her purpose. It wasn't just about teaching someone how to cook or how to balance the books in a cafe. It was about teaching them to trust themselves, to build something from the ground up, just as she had done. At first, the program started small. Gwen reached out to a few local culinary schools and industry contacts, asking if they knew anyone who would benefit from mentorship. She didn't know how it would unfold, but the more she talked about it, the more she realized that this was what she was meant to do. This was the legacy she had been waiting for. A few weeks later, a young woman named Emily walked into Gwen's cafe, wide-eyed and eager. Emily was 23, fresh out of culinary school in Dallas, and full of ambition. Her energy reminded Gwen of her own at that age. Hungry for success, but unsure of how to go about it. "I've heard your story," Emily said as Gwen poured her a cup of coffee. "How you built this cafe from nothing. I want to do that too, but I don't know where to start." Gwen smiled, the same quiet understanding settling in her chest. She had been in Emily's shoes once. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with more obstacles than anyone cared to acknowledge. But the one thing Gwen had learned over the years was that it was possible. If you were willing to put in the work, if you were willing to believe in yourself when the world doubted you. "It's not easy," Gwen told her, leaning in a little, her voice steady. "But the most important thing is knowing that it's going to be hard. And that's okay. If you're doing something you love, it'll always be worth it." Emily's eyes lit up as she took a sip of her coffee. Gwen could see the doubt begin to fade from her face, replaced with a yes. Someone else the chance to stand where she had once stood, to rise above the fear and uncertainty, to push through and create something meaningful. Over the next few months, Emily worked under Gwen's guidance, learning everything from managing inventory to handling customers. But the most important lessons were the quiet ones, the ones Gwen had learned from years of facing failure, rejection, and loss. She taught Emily that setbacks were inevitable, but they didn't define you. She taught her that the people who would doubt you the most were often the ones who didn't see your potential. And most importantly, she taught her that success wasn't just about numbers or recognition. It was about building something that lasted, something that would carry you even when everything else fell apart. As Emily's confidence grew, so did Gwen's sense of fulfillment. The more she mentored, the more she realized that this was where her true power lay. Not in the cafe itself, but in the people she could lift up. She had always thought that she was meant to run a business, to be the one in charge, to have the spotlight. But the spotlight didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the quiet joy of seeing someone else succeed because of the small part you played in their journey. The cafe became a place of learning, a place where aspiring chefs could come to hone their skills, and it became the beating heart of the community. Gwen's story, once one of loss and betrayal, had become a beacon of hope for others. Her cafe was no longer just a business. It was a symbol of resilience, of what could happen when someone chose not to give up, even when it seemed easier to walk away. One evening, as Gwen was locking up for the night, she caught a glimpse of Sasha, the investor who had helped her get the cafe off the ground. Sasha had been a quiet supporter from the very beginning, offering advice, funding, and most importantly, belief in Gwen's vision. She had been the first person to see the potential in Gwen when she had nothing left to give. "You've done something amazing here," Sasha said, her voice warm as she leaned against the counter. "Not just with the cafe, but with everything you're building now. You're not just changing the lives of your customers. You're changing the lives of people like Emily. That's something special." Gwen smiled softly, her eyes moving over the cafe as the last customers trickled out into the night. It was quiet now, but it felt like the calm before something even bigger. "I never thought it would be like this," Gwen said quietly, her voice tinged with a sense of wonder. "I thought it was just about the business, just about the cafe. But it's not. It's about people. It's about creating something that means something to others. And I think that's what I've built here." Sasha nodded, her eyes glimmering with approval. "And you're going to keep building, Gwen. This is just the beginning. There's more for you to do. You'll see." As the doors closed behind them, Gwen stood there for a moment, letting the words sink in. This was her triumph, her quiet victory. She had fought against every odd, every person who had doubted her, every moment when it seemed like the world was too big to conquer. And now, she was standing in the very place that had once felt like the end of her dream. It wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. She wasn't just building a cafe anymore. She was building a legacy, one that would last long after the last cup of coffee had been served. And with that, Gwen Wilkins knew that she had won. It was a typical evening in Austin, the streets bustling with the vibrancy of young professionals, families, and tourists winding down their days with dinner and drinks. The weather was warm, a soft breeze lifting the air just enough to make the evening feel like a moment suspended in time. Gwen stood in the kitchen of her cafe, wiping down the counter after the last few customers had left, taking in the quiet hum of the place. The cafe had become her sanctuary, a reflection of everything she had fought for and built from the ground up. But tonight, as she looked around, something felt different. There was a sense of completion, a feeling that she had truly arrived at the place she was meant to be. But as she stood there, Gwen couldn't shake the thought that there was more she still wanted to do, more people to help, more stories to be written. Her story was far from over, but she was beginning to realize that she wasn't just building a business. She was creating a community. It had been over a year since she had opened her mentorship program, and she had watched the young chefs and entrepreneurs who had walked through her doors grow in ways she hadn't expected. Emily, the first person she had mentored, had since opened her own small bakery just a few blocks away, drawing a loyal crowd with her innovative pastries and comforting vibe. Carlos, another young chef, had partnered with Gwen to host culinary workshops, teaching others the fine art of cooking with local ingredients, and quickly earning a reputation in the city's tight-knit food scene. But there was one person who had been the most unexpected success story of all: Kelsey, her old friend from Chicago, the one who had once been so indifferent to her struggles. Kelsey had returned to Austin after a few years in New York, where she had been struggling to find her own path in the culinary world. Gwen hadn't heard from her in years, and honestly hadn't expected much when Kelsey reached out. But over time, they rekindled their friendship, and Gwen had invited Kelsey to work at the cafe, something she hadn't expected to do, given their complicated past. As they worked side by side, Gwen saw how much Kelsey had changed. She wasn't the same person who had once brushed off Gwen's struggles. She had grown, not just in her craft, but in her understanding of what it meant to help others. Kelsey was now working on opening her own cafe with Gwen's guidance, and this time, it wasn't about competition or comparisons. It was about two people who had found common ground in their journeys, who had both learned that success wasn't about taking from others. It was about giving back. The cafe became a place of collaboration, a hub where chefs, artists, and entrepreneurs gathered, sharing ideas, struggles, and triumphs. It was a far cry from the isolated, single-minded business Gwen had first imagined for herself. As her mentor program grew, she realized that her greatest asset wasn't the food or the coffee. It was the connections she had cultivated. The impact she had made on others was something far greater than she had ever anticipated. One evening, as she sat down with Sasha, the investor who had supported her from the very beginning, they shared a quiet drink in the corner of the cafe, looking out at the busy street. "You've done something incredible, Gwen," Sasha said, her voice filled with admiration. "Not just with the business, but with the community you've built around it. You're not just a cafe owner anymore. You're an inspiration to so many people." Gwen glanced around at the cafe, her heart swelling with pride. She had done it. She had taken everything, every setback, every failure, and turned it into something meaningful, something lasting. "I never imagined it would be like this," Gwen said softly, her eyes scanning the cafe as her employees laughed and joked with customers. "But I'm glad it is." Sasha smiled, setting her glass down. "This isn't just the beginning for your business. It's the beginning of your legacy, Gwen. People will remember what you've built here, not just the cafe, but the way you've touched lives, helped others rise. You've changed the way people think about success." Gwen felt a lump in her throat as she absorbed Sasha's words. Legacy. The word had always seemed so far out of reach, a distant dream that she couldn't quite grasp. But now, as she stood at the forefront of this growing movement, it didn't feel so distant anymore. It was real. It was happening. And it was all because she had chosen to rise above the pain, the betrayal, and the uncertainty. The following day, Gwen hosted a community event, a celebration of local talent, food, and the connections that had been made through her mentorship program. It was more than just an event. It was a statement that the community she had fostered wasn't just about a single cafe. It was about a collective effort, a network of people who were building each other up, lifting one another towards success. The event was packed, with people from all walks of life coming together to share stories and celebrate the work they had done. As Gwen mingled with the guests, she caught a glimpse of Emily, now confidently speaking with a group of aspiring chefs. She saw Carlos and Kelsey, laughing over shared memories of the early days, before they had all known how much their lives would change. It wasn't just a cafe anymore. It was a family, a place where dreams were nurtured and where people weren't afraid to fail, because they knew they would have a support system to pick them up again. That evening, as Gwen stood outside her cafe, looking up at the starry sky, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The journey hadn't been easy. It had been painful, at times almost too much to bear. But now, standing in front of the business she had built from the ground up, Gwen realized that she had achieved something greater than success. She had found fulfillment. She had found a way to make a difference in the lives of others. And in doing so, she had built a legacy that would last long after the last cup of coffee had been served. Gwen had not only rebuilt her life, she had given others the opportunity to rebuild theirs, too. Years had passed since Gwen first opened the doors to her cafe in Austin, and the city had changed alongside her. What had started as a small venture, fueled by personal pain and a desire to prove her worth, had blossomed into something far greater than she could have imagined. The cafe was no longer just a business, it was a symbol of resilience, of rising from the ashes, and of building something lasting when everything around you seemed to be falling apart. Gwen had never sought fame or recognition. She hadn't started her journey to be admired or remembered. She had simply wanted to create something that reflected her truth. But as she stood in the middle of the bustling cafe one morning, watching her staff move in rhythm with the demands of the day, she realized something profound. Her success wasn't just in the cafe. It was in the people she had touched. It was in the young chefs she had mentored, like Emily and Carlos, who were now running their own restaurants. It was in the people who came through her doors, not just for a cup of coffee, but for the sense of community she had fostered. It was in the quiet moments when she would look around and see the diversity of the crowd, the different walks of life, all coming together in one space. It wasn't just about business, it was about connection. But even as she stood at the heart of this growing success, she knew that the real measure of her legacy was something even deeper. It was in the hearts of the people who had been a part of her journey. It was in their stories of growth, of redemption, of new beginnings. And now it was time to pass on the torch. The decision had come to her slowly over the past year. She had spent countless hours thinking about the future, about what she wanted to leave behind, and how she could continue to help others in a more profound way. She wasn't ready to walk away from the cafe just yet, but she knew that the next step in her journey was about more than just running a business. Gwen made the decision to sell the cafe, not to someone who would treat it as a profit-driven enterprise, but to someone who shared her values, a person who would nurture it just as she had. She had been approached by Isabel, a local businesswoman with a passion for community-driven businesses, and after several conversations, Gwen knew she had found the right person. "I've seen what you've done here," Isabel had said one afternoon, as they sat across from each other, the warm light of the cafe spilling over them. "You've created something more than just a business. You've created a place where people come together, where they find purpose and connection. I want to carry that forward." The decision wasn't easy, but it felt right. Gwen's heart swelled with pride as she handed over the keys to Isabel, knowing that the legacy she had built would continue to thrive. The cafe would always be a part of her, but it was time for her to step away and let someone else take it to the next level. With the sale complete, Gwen found herself reflecting on the journey she had been on. How far she had come from that small, broken cafe in Chicago, how much pain she had endured, and how many times she had thought about giving up. She had lost so much, but in the process, she had gained something far more valuable than anything material. Her sense of self, her strength, and her ability to impact others. The next chapter in Gwen's life wasn't one of retreat. It was one of expansion. She knew now that her calling wasn't just in business. It was in empowering others to create change in their own lives. She continued her mentorship program, but now with a broader vision. To create a foundation that would help women and underrepresented groups in the culinary industry get the resources and support they needed to succeed. It wasn't just about teaching them how to cook. It was about teaching them how to build their own legacies. As Gwen sat at a small desk in her new office, overlooking the city that had become her home, she realized that her legacy was never going to be confined to the walls of her cafe. It was in the ripple effect she had created, one that would continue to spread, reaching new people, new communities, and new generations. In the end, Gwen's greatest triumph wasn't the business she had built. It wasn't the money or the accolades. It was in the lives she had touched, the seeds she had planted, and the quiet, unspoken power she had given others to stand on their own 2 feet. Her legacy was a living, breathing thing, and it would continue long after she was gone. As the years passed, Gwen stood outside her old cafe one last time, the sun setting behind her. The city had grown, but she had grown with it. She had seen so many come and go, watched them walk the same path she had walked, watched them rise as she had risen. And it was enough. The peace she felt now wasn't the peace of success. It was the peace of knowing that she had left something meaningful behind. She walked barefoot through the soft grass outside her new office, the faint sound of traffic in the distance. With each step, she felt the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the losses, all of it fading into something lighter, something more graceful. The future was bright. Her legacy was secure. If you've ever been dismissed, don't worry. Quiet strength is still strength.